Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. My hands were already reaching when I came back. Left palm pressed to my ribs, right cupping the underside of my jaw, searching for injuries that had killed me less than a minute ago in a body that carried no trace of them. The uniform under my fingers was pressed and whole. The bridge of the Kearney continued around me without interruption. Every station occupied, every console throwing data across its display, every face turned toward work that none of them remembered having done before. I forced my hands down to the armrests and held them there until the phantom burning in my ribs faded to something I could manage. Lieutenant Commander Pete Bewley sat at tactical 12 feet to my left, running fleet position diagnostics. The forward viewport showed the brown dwarf's rubble field, a rust-colored wash of dead particulate from a star that had never fully ignited, shedding enough magnetic interference to mask our drive signatures from long-range detection. 47 ships held position in that shadow, 23 warships and escorts of various tonnage, 24 civilian transports, 200,000 people, the last surviving population of the human species. What remained after the Battle of Kessler Threshold, where the combined United Systems fleet had met the Covenant's full armada and been destroyed in under 6 hours. I inherited command because everyone above me was dead. I had been a logistics officer, a man who managed supply chains, crew rotations, fuel distribution, maintenance windows, replacement parts, the routes by which a civilization kept itself alive. Now I was the last Admiral, parked in the magnetic lee of a failed star, burning fuel we could never replace while waiting for me to tell humanity where to run next. My coffee sat in the cup holder at my right elbow. 4 minutes old. It was always 4 minutes old at this moment. "Admiral," Bewley said, rotating his chair, "fleet status. All ships holding within the magnetic shadow. Fuel reserves across the civilian convoy averaging 41.3%, down from 44. The Ridgeway is burning heavy because her port thruster housing torqued during the last jump. Captain Moss hasn't filed the maintenance report because he thinks his engineers can shim the alignment before anyone notices." Bewley's hand stopped above his console. "That's accurate, sir. I was about to flag the Ridgeway variance." "I know." I watched the viewport. I had done it again, reciting information before it was reported, speaking with a certainty no fleet admiral should possess about the internal maintenance schedules of individual convoy ships. The last time I made this mistake, Bewley had asked how I knew. I told him I had reviewed the engineering logs overnight. He accepted it because the alternative, that his commanding officer had lived through this conversation thousands of times and could no longer sustain the performance of hearing things for the first time, was beyond what a reasonable man would consider. The portside hatch opened. Captain Dennis Hargrove came through carrying his own coffee, black, his square face already set in the focused expression he wore during pre-watch briefings. Hargrove was the Kearney's commanding officer, a blunt-spoken career combat officer with 30 years of bridge watches behind him and a nose that had been broken at least twice. He ran the ship. I ran the fleet. The arrangement had kept 200,000 people alive through 11 months of retreat, or through one perpetually repeating 4-hour window, depending on which version of events you had access to. "Morning, Admiral." He set his cup down at his station to my right. "I've got the civilian convoy fuel numbers for already covered. Bewley's flagging the Ridgeway." Hargrove looked at Bewley. Bewley confirmed with a careful nod. Hargrove adjusted something on his console that needed no adjustment, a habit he defaulted to when deciding whether to say something difficult. "Sir, the senior staff has been asking about the next jump window. Planning needs a destination, and navigation is waiting on your authorization. I'll have it within the hour." "Within the hour." Hargrove turned the phrase over, evaluating my reliability more than my timeline. "Admiral, I've noticed you anticipating briefings before they're delivered. Just now you gave Bewley the Ridgeway variance before he had flagged it, and you cut off my fuel report before I delivered it. Draper talks too much. That's the wrong answer, sir. I looked at him directly. He held the look, professional, evaluating, unwilling to let it go. In another iteration, maybe 300 cycles back, I had told Hargrove the truth. Every word of it. The loop, the deaths, the 6,000 repetitions. He had listened carefully and then initiated a command competency review that pulled me off the bridge for the rest of the cycle. The Covenant arrived. The fleet fought without my coordination. Everyone died. I woke in the chair with the coffee at 4 minutes old and never told him again. I hear you, Dennis. What I need right now is the next few hours of you doing your job while I do mine. Hargrove studied me for another beat, then returned to his console. He would accept it for now. He always did at this stage. The doubt would build over the next few hours as my behavior grew stranger, but by then the Covenant would be here, and the question of my mental state would become academic. 3 hours later, Bewley's console cut through the bridge chatter with a short, repeating alarm. The tactical system's warning for spatial disruption events. Every head on the bridge turned toward the display. Slipspace rupture bearing 270 relative, Bewley called. Distance, close, inside the rubble field. General quarters, Hargrove ordered. The Kearney shifted from watch routine to combat stations. I stayed in my chair. The forward viewport showed the rubble field splitting. A seam of white-blue light opened in the rust-colored particulate, and through it, something began to emerge. The Covenant Cathedral warship arrived compressed, a dark, angular mass pushing through from whatever dimension their drives used for transit, and then it unfolded. Structural sections extended outward in sequence, each one locking into position with visible force, blade-edged spires and buttressed weapon platforms spreading in the pattern of a building assembling itself from its own skeleton. The full deployment took roughly 90 seconds. The finished structure was the size of a small city district, bristling with launch bays and battery housings, its silhouette dominated by knife-edged spires that gave the whole thing the proportions of something built for worship and killing simultaneously. Across every speaker on the bridge, across every radio channel on every ship in the fleet, the broadcast began. Alien liturgical audio, dense and polytonal, ground through the communications frequencies with enough power to override our encryption and fill every receiver with sound. Coordination signal and sacred text fused into one. The Covenant always broadcast when they arrived. The extinction of a species was a sacrament to them, and sacraments required accompaniment. Boarding pod launch in approximately 8 minutes, Bewley reported. Standard intercept formation, 6 pursuit cruisers coming through behind the primary, deploying in crescent. Get me fleet-wide, Hargrove said, reaching for the command channel. I stood. Belay that. Hargrove turned. His hand stayed on the channel switch. Open a broad-spectrum channel to the Covenant flagship, I said. All frequencies, unencrypted. The bridge went very quiet. Sir, Bewley said, broad spectrum, unencrypted. I want them to hear this. Hargrove stepped toward me. Admiral, they're deploying assault formation. We have less than 10 minutes before... I know the timeline, Dennis. Open the channel. Hargrove held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then he signaled the communications officer, who opened the channel. I spoke into the open broadcast, my voice carrying across every frequency the Covenant was monitoring. This is Fleet Admiral Raymond Lusk, commanding the United Systems Remnant Fleet. I am requesting formal negotiation for terms of surrender. I will board your vessel under diplomatic protocol. Respond on any channel. Behind me, I could hear Hargrove breathing. Bewley had gone still at his console. The bridge crew, 19 men who had spent 11 months fighting, running, and surviving under my command, stared at me with an expression I had seen only once before across all my iterations. The time the Kearney's reactor had begun to fail, and everyone on board understood they were going to die in a way that could not be outrun. The Covenant broadcast shifted. The liturgical audio dropped in volume, reduced as though making room, and through it came a response in translated human speech, toneless and mathematically constructed. "The surrender is received. The sacrament of submission will be honored. Send the commander." I adjusted my uniform. It was still perfectly clean. "Get my shuttle prepped and have an escort standing by," I told Hargrove. The shuttle crossed the gap between the Kearney and the Cathedral warship in 11 minutes. I sat in the passenger bay with 2 Marines and a communications officer named Garrett. Standard surrender protocol required an honor guard, and refusing to bring one would have signaled something other than submission. Through the shuttle's portside viewport, I could see the Covenant formation from outside the fleet for the first time. The pursuit cruisers held their crescent at predictable intervals, each one a bladed hull roughly the size of a human destroyer, weapons ports visible along their lateral ridges. The Cathedral warship dominated the center, its spires catching the brown dwarf's dim light. At the rear of the formation, under heavy escort, travelled a vessel I had never studied before. Smaller than the cruisers, rounded and smooth, its hull shaped less like a weapon than a container built to preserve what it carried. 2 Guardian ships flanked it, holding tight. In 6,000 iterations of fighting this fleet, I had never had reason to look at it closely. It had always been behind the ships that were killing me. I noted its position and returned my attention to the approach. The Cathedral warship's docking bay swallowed the shuttle without ceremony. Clamps locked the hull, and the bay doors ground shut behind us. The space was enormous, built for craft 3 times our shuttle's tonnage, and every surface carried carved geometric patterns worked into the structural metal. The carvings were dense, interlocking, functional. They followed the load-bearing supports and stress points of the architecture, as though engineering and theology were one discipline, each wall and beam simultaneously structural and scriptural. The escort waiting on the docking platform was ceremonial. 8 Covenant soldiers in articulated armor carried weapons I recognized from boarding actions, curved blade polearms and sidearms that fired superheated projectiles. They formed a processional column without speaking and guided us deeper into the ship. The corridors were tall enough that I felt their proportions in my chest. A compression, a sense of walking through something scaled for procession. The ribbed supports overhead incorporated bone, pale and polished, set into the metal framework at regular intervals. Some pieces were large enough to suggest species with skeletal structures far larger than human. Others were small, delicate, almost ornamental. Trophies from prior hunts, prior sacraments. The species these bones had belonged to were gone, absorbed into the Covenant's theological archive as completed entries in a record I could not decipher. They brought us to a chamber along the Cathedral warship's central axis, a space roughly the size of the Kearney's main hangar, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow and a floor of dark stone inlaid with more geometric carvings. Illumination came from panels set into the walls at intervals, cycling slowly through color temperatures that matched the rhythm of the broadcast, still grinding through every frequency. At the far end of the chamber, a raised platform held a single figure, the prelate. I knew the rank from intelligence briefings compiled before the war, when humanity still maintained diplomatic channels and believed the Covenant could be negotiated with. The prelate was the combined supreme religious and military authority of a Covenant hunting fleet, priest and admiral fused into a single command role, because the Covenant recognized no distinction between those functions. War was worship. Worship was war. The rank was sovereign within the fleet it commanded. This one was tall, armored in ceremonial plate that looked heavy enough to serve as structural support, with bone fragments from previous extinctions embedded in the chest piece and pauldrons. The face, if I could call it a face, was a complex arrangement of sensory structures human xenobiology had never fully mapped, partly concealed behind a mask of carved bone that covered the upper portion. 4 deep-set, reflective eyes tracked my approach. I stopped at the base of the platform. My Marines flanked me. Garrett held the translation equipment, I had prepared a formal surrender statement, and I delivered it now, slowly, clearly in the language and format our pre-war diplomatic corps had established for first contact negotiations. The words were meaningless. I was buying time. Every second in this chamber, let me watch the prelate's ritual behavior, searching for the structural assumptions that governed what the Covenant could and could not do with a surrendering enemy. The prelate received my statement through its own translation system and began the counter-ritual. A sequence of formal responses unfolded. Invocation, acknowledgement, witness, registration. The surrender was being processed as a sacramental step, a required movement in the Extinction protocol, with specific prayers, pauses, and physical positions the prelate assumed at each stage. I filed every one. The waiting periods between ritual elements were mandatory. The Covenant moved through faith as if through machinery. Each step had to engage before the next could follow. Midway through the fourth element, the prelate stopped. All four eyes fixed on my hands. I had been pressing my ribs again without realizing it, covering the spot where the boarding blade had killed me 2 iterations ago. The prelate studied the gesture, studied the way my weight shifted toward the wound that was gone, then studied my face with an intensity that made the 2 Marines behind me adjust their grip on their sidearms. The prelate spoke a word. Garrett's translation unit processed it for 2 full seconds before producing an approximation. Recursor. Then the prelate knelt. The ceremonial armor ground against the platform stone. The bone-masked head dipped until those 4 eyes were below my sightline. The 8 Covenant soldiers in the escort stayed perfectly still, as though this was expected, as though a supreme commander kneeling before a surrendering enemy was a recognized part of the procedure. The recursor is confirmed, the translation rendered. The one who returns, the one who witnesses the sacrament of extinction and is returned to witness it again. You carry the wounds of deaths that have not yet occurred. Your hands search for injuries your body has forgotten. You are the proof. I kept my face neutral. The Marines were tense, confused, reading the kneeling as either submission or the prelude to violence. Proof of what? I said. The prelate rose. The tone of the translated speech shifted, less formal, more instructional, the register of a theologian addressing a student who has walked into a truth he cannot escape. Every species we have guided to sacramental completion has produced a recursor, one being always one granted return, one witness to relive the final hunt, one mind to find every possible route of flight and use them one by one until all have been exhausted. The recursor always believes this is a weapon, a tool of survival. The prelate paused. The 4 eyes reflected me. The recursor is mistaken. It gestured toward the rear of the chamber in a direction that I understood, with cold, immediate clarity, corresponded to the rounded vessel at the back of the formation. Every route you have found is already recorded. The sacred archive carries the authorized paths of every sacrament. When the recursor chooses, the archive has always contained the choosing. Cause is a lesser sequence. Scripture is bound to deeper law. Garrett's device clicked as it struggled through the last phrase. I said, "What archive?" The reliquary vessel, the repository of every completed sacrament, the bones of every species guided to its end, carved with the paths it chose during its final running. Your bones are being prepared now. Your roots are being cut as you find them, and once cut, they have always been cut. You will find every path already written. I had come looking for a blind spot, a structural weakness in the Covenant's pursuit doctrine that I could exploit tactically. I had found my entire tactical framework, every retreat route I had discovered across 6,000 deaths, reduced to a footnote in someone else's scripture. The loop was their liturgical evidence. I was performing my role in it, exactly as every recursor before me had performed theirs. The prelate settled back into the formal posture that signaled the next ritual element. The surrender sacrament continued. I let it. The prelate kept speaking, laying out the theological certainties of humanity's extinction with the calm assurance of a professional describing completed paperwork. And I needed the information more than escape. Then the sacrament reached its conclusion. The closing act was the execution of the surrendering commander. The Covenant did not accept surrenders. The surrender ritual was a formalized registration of despair, and its completion required the death of the one who offered it. The prelate gave a signal. The escort moved. The last thing I registered was the blade entering below my collarbone, angled down through the chest cavity, a killing stroke I recognized from boarding actions, performed now with the trained certainty of ritual, my blood marking the geometric carvings on the chamber floor in a pattern that was probably also scripture. I woke in the chair with my left hand on my ribs and my right pressed below my collarbone, covering the entry point of a blade that had killed me 4 seconds ago. The coffee was 4 minutes old. The bridge was in pre-watch configuration. Bewley was drawing breath to deliver the fleet status report. Admiral, fleet status. All ships holding, fuel at 41.3. The Ridgeway is burning heavy. I stood. Pete, I need you off tactical. You're flying a shuttle for me in approximately 3 hours. Bewley blinked. Sir? Captain Hargrove will handle tactical for the engagement. I need a pilot who can thread a shuttle through active weapons fire at close range, and you're the best small craft pilot on this ship. The portside hatch opened. Hargrove came through with his coffee. Dennis, I said before he could speak. Fuel report. I've seen the numbers. I need the bridge for a briefing in 30 minutes, and after that, I need you running tactical for the fight. Hargrove set his coffee down slowly. What fight? The Covenant will arrive at bearing 270 in approximately 3 hours and 14 minutes. Cathedral warship and 6 pursuit cruisers in standard crescent formation. I'm going to give you a battle plan that will keep the fleet intact for 40 minutes. During that window, I'm taking a shuttle to a vessel at the rear of their formation. You're leaving the bridge during combat. Yes. Hargrove looked at me the way he always looked at me when I said something that violated every principle of fleet command he had spent his career absorbing. I could time the phases of his reaction. Initial disbelief, practical assessment, reluctant calculation of whether I had broken or possessed information he did not. How can you know any of that, sir? The same way I know the fuel numbers, the Ridgeway's thruster problem, and what Draper's message said before it was decrypted. If you follow my orders exactly as timed, the fleet survives the engagement. If you deviate or improvise, the civilian ships in grid sectors 4 through 6 will be inside Covenant boarding range for 11 minutes instead of 4, and the Ridgeway and the Caldwell will both be destroyed. You know this. I know it the way I've known everything I shouldn't know since this watch began. You've noticed, Dennis. Your crew has noticed. I'm asking you to act on it instead of questioning it, because in 3 hours we run out of time for this conversation. Hargrove's expression did not soften, but something in his posture shifted, the rigid set of his shoulders loosening by a fraction, the way a man's body adjusts when he stops bracing against a weight and starts calculating how to carry it. 40 minutes, he said. 40 minutes. I'll be back before the second wave of boarding pods. I spent the next 2 hours writing the battle orders by hand. Every fleet maneuver, every weapons fire window, every formation change that would keep 47 ships alive and fighting while opening a gap in the Covenant formation wide enough for a single shuttle to reach the vessel at the rear. I had 6,000 iterations of experience with this engagement, every Covenant approach vector, every response time, every formation adjustment they executed when a specific ship fired from a specific bearing. The document I produced was a transcription of accumulated observations so detailed that it bordered on prophecy. That word stopped me. Prophecy. The prelate had used the same concept to describe what was carved in the reliquary vessel. Routes already written, outcomes already recorded. I was writing my own version now, converting repetition into prediction, and the structural similarity was precise enough to be uncomfortable. I had spent my pre-war life arranging dependencies, which ship needed fuel, which convoy needed parts, which route stayed open if another route closed. Logistics was never glory. It was the quiet art of knowing that a fleet was only as strong as the thing it could not afford to lose. The Covenant had a dependency too. They had mistaken it for a god. I finished the orders. 12 pages, handwritten, time-stamped to the second. I gave them to Hargrove. He looked through the first page, then at me, and folded the stack into his breast pocket. "If these are wrong," he started, "there's an error of about 12 seconds in the timing on page 9. The Kearney will need to adjust her firing arc by 2 degrees port during the 23rd minute. Everything else is accurate." "You're telling me you know you're wrong about a specific detail on a specific page of orders for a battle that hasn't started?" "I know where my predictions drift. The correction is already noted in the margin." Hargrove put his hand on the folded pages in his pocket. Whatever private assessment he was conducting about whether his fleet admiral had broken under pressure, whatever accounting of my recent behavior he was running against the 30-year standard of command competence he carried in his bones. The man was going to follow the orders. He was a career officer. He had spent 3 decades following directives from men he didn't fully understand, and the habit was deeper than doubt. The Covenant arrived on schedule. The cathedral warship unfolded against the rust-colored rubble field. The alien broadcast filled every speaker, dense and polytonal, substituting for a declaration of intent. Boarding pods launched from the cathedral warship's ventral bays on their standard trajectory, and the Kearney fired at the timestamp I had written on page 1. I left the bridge. Hargrove did not watch me go. He was already reading page 2. Bewley was waiting at the shuttle bay, the small craft powered and running departure checks. 2 Marines climbed in after me, the same 2 I had taken to the cathedral warship in the previous iteration. One of them, a sergeant named Foley, had a habit of checking his sidearm 3 times before any deployment. He checked it 3 times now. In one iteration, months ago by my private accounting, I had watched him teach a civilian child from the Galena how to clear a jammed ration printer using the same concentration he gave to combat drills. In another, he had died holding a pressure door closed with both hands while the compartment beyond it vented to vacuum. "Where are we heading, sir?" Bewley asked from the pilot's seat. "Rear of their formation. Dark-hulled vessel under escort. You'll see it once we clear the engagement zone." "And what's on the vessel?" "That's what I need to find out." Bewley powered the shuttle through the bay doors and into the rubble field. Behind us, the fleet moved in the formation I had prescribed. The Jessup and the Lanham, drawing the pursuit cruiser's attention starboard, while the civilian convoy executed a jump feint that pulled 2 Covenant ships out of position. Through the rear viewport, I watched my handwritten prophecy execute itself. Every maneuver timed, every response anticipated. The fleet and the Covenant moving together in a sequence I had observed so many times that the violence had taken on the quality of choreography. The gap I needed opened in the crescent formation exactly when I had predicted, a corridor of reduced fire between the 4th and 5th pursuit cruisers, wide enough for a shuttle running without active emissions. Bewley found it without being told. The man had an instinct for combat piloting that I had watched develop and truncate across thousands of iterations. In some he survived the battle, in many he did not, and he threaded the corridor with corrections so small they registered as twitches in the control yoke. The reliquary grew in the forward viewport, dark hull, rounded architecture, 2 Guardian ships flanking it, their weapons tracking the larger engagement. "That's a temple ship," Bewley said. He was reading the hull configuration, the absence of visible weapons batteries, the ceremonial markings on the armor plating. "Sir, intelligence didn't even confirm these existed." "They exist. Put us on the ventral docking port. We have approximately 35 minutes before Hargrove's orders run out and the fleet loses coordination." Bewley banked the shuttle hard. The Guardian ships had not reacted. Their formation protected the reliquary from threats originating ahead of the Covenant fleet, from a fleeing enemy that might send a desperate strike from the direction of retreat. They were poorly positioned for a threat arriving from inside their own formation. The shuttle locked onto the ventral port. The hull seals engaged. I checked my sidearm. Foley checked his for the fourth time. "Stay with the shuttle," I told Bewley. "Keep the engines hot. If the Guardian ships reorient toward us, detach and evade without waiting." We breached the airlock and went inside. The reliquary's corridors were narrower than the cathedral warships, the ceilings lower, every surface carrying the compressed density of a place built for preservation rather than display. The air was cold and dry. It tasted faintly mineral through the suit filters, like dust from stone ground too fine to see. Somewhere deeper in the ship, something clicked at measured intervals. Tool on bone, then silence, then the same sound again. Foley took point with his sidearm drawn. The second Marine, Corporal Dahl, covered our rear. I moved between them, counting doorways and intersections, extrapolating the ship's layout from the architectural principles I had observed aboard the cathedral warship. The first sealed chamber we passed bore markings I could not identify, geometric patterns rendered in a colour of bone that suggested extreme age. Through a crack in the chamber's seal, I caught a glimpse of what lay inside. Bone slabs upright in rows, carved with dense three-dimensional patterns. Biological specimens suspended in resin. Objects that might have been tools or weapons preserved behind transparent barriers. The second chamber was sealed with different markings. The third, different still. Each one unique. Each one representing a completed extinction. A species the Covenant had hunted to sacramental completion. Its remains archived here as record, proof, and authorization. I stopped counting chambers after 40. The corridor continued ahead, curving with the reliquary's hull, and more sealed doors lined both walls for as far as the emergency lighting allowed me to see. The scale was the first horror. This archive held hundreds of completed extinctions, thousands of years of Covenant sacramental practice, the theological record of a civilization that had been exterminating other civilizations for longer than human beings, had possessed written language. The human chamber was open. I knew it immediately. The markings on its frame were fresher than the sealed chambers, the geometric patterns still being carved into the border by tools set aside recently. Pale dust gathered along the threshold. The air inside carried a warmer metallic scent beneath the mineral dryness, as if the room itself had been handled too often by living things. This was an active workspace. I went in. Foley covered the door. The chamber was roughly 30 feet deep and 20 wide, lined floor to ceiling with bone slabs set upright in parallel rows. Each slab was approximately the size of a door, pale and dense, mounted in metal brackets that held it at a specific angle. The carvings on their surfaces were three-dimensional. Routes through space, rendered in a notation system that took me several seconds to pass. Spatial coordinates, gravitational markers, stellar reference points, all translated into the Covenant's geometric language and inscribed into bone with a care that suggested the carving process was itself a form of worship. Then I recognized one. A slab near the chamber entrance bore a pattern that corresponded to the fleet's retreat through the Maddox Nebula, a route I had found in iteration 412. I remembered it because it had been one of my first major successes, a path that exploited the nebula's electromagnetic interference to mask our slipspace signature, buying the fleet 6 full days before the Covenant reacquired our trail. I had been proud of that route. I had believed I was learning the shape of the problem, getting closer to the solution. The slab's bone carried Covenant archival dating markers, numerical notations I had learned to approximate aboard the cathedral warship, that indicated an age of roughly 300 years, before first contact, before Kessler threshold, before the loop, before I was born. I moved deeper into the chamber, more slabs, more roots. The gas giant magnetic shadow maneuver from iteration 1016 carved in bone, dated to 280 years before the war. The double jump through the Varden pulsar cluster that I had spent nearly 800 iterations perfecting. Carved, dated, archived. The civilian ship decoy formation that had worked for 9 consecutive cycles before the Covenant adapted their pursuit pattern. Carved, the counter-adaptation noted in a secondary inscription on the same slab. Every retreat I had discovered through thousands of deaths was already here, inscribed in scripture that predated my species' ability to travel between stars. The prelate had told the truth, or something worse than truth. The reliquary ratified events outside ordinary sequence. When the recursor chose a path, the path had always been present. The Covenant did not need to understand time the way we did. Their sacrament ran through it like a wire through a wall, hidden until something burned. I had been performing. Every tactical success, every hard-won escape route, every iteration where I had believed I was outmaneuvering the Covenant had fulfilled existing prophecy. The recursor confirms. Admiral. Foley's voice came from the doorway, controlled and low. Movement in the corridor. Multiple contacts coming this direction. I had less than a minute. The slabs were not all carved. At first I had read the blank surfaces as unfinished work, places waiting to receive the routes I had not yet discovered. That was true, but incomplete. The chamber was arranged by vector. Rows of carved slabs angled away from a central axis I now understood to be the Covenant's standard approach bearing. Retreat routes. Flights through nebulae around gas giants, past dead moons and pulsar clusters, each one grouped by the direction in which prey had fled. I stepped between 2 rows. The carved faces looked outward. All of them. I turned. The blank slabs faced inward. Their polished surfaces occupied positions that corresponded to approach vectors, bearings that pointed toward the Covenant formation, toward the cathedral warship, toward the reliquary itself. A chamber full of scripture, and here were the silences in it. The empty places marked impossible routes. The Covenant's prophecy contained no entry for prey that attacked. The entire archive, this chamber and the hundreds of sealed chambers lining the corridors, was built on a foundational assumption. The hunted species runs. Flight was the theological precondition. The prophecies could only authorize routes that moved away from the Covenant, because the Covenant's religion defined the prey's role as retreat. An attack occupied a category their prophetic system could not generate. The blind spot was doctrinal, and it was total. Admiral, they're here. Foley raised his sidearm. I moved toward the doorway. 4 reliquary guardians came around the corridor, bend at speed, armored, carrying the curved blade polearms I recognized from the cathedral warship. Foley fired. The first guardian dropped. The second absorbed a round through its shoulder plating and kept coming. Dahl opened fire from the far side of the doorway, catching the third in the flank as it turned. The fourth reached Foley before he could adjust his aim. The polearm entered below the Marine's armored vest and angled upward. Foley went down without a sound. Dahl killed the 4th Guardian with 2 rounds to center mass, and then we were moving, back down the corridor toward the shuttle bay. Dahl covering our retreat with his sidearm while I ran. More Guardians appeared behind us. A superheated projectile caught Dahl through his right calf. He stumbled into the corridor wall. I grabbed the carrying strap on his vest and hauled him forward. The shuttle bay was 50 meters ahead, then 40, then 30. We reached the bay. The shuttle was still locked to the docking port, engines running, Bewley visible through the cockpit glass. Dahl collapsed against the airlock frame. Blood pooled beneath his leg, and the wound was deep enough that I could see the white of severed tendon. I pulled him through the airlock and sealed it. "Get us off this port and clear," I told Bewley. Bewley detached and accelerated hard. Through the rear viewport, both Guardian escort ships were reorienting, turning their weapons arrays toward our shuttle and tracking our departure vector. Their formation had been built to protect the reliquary from a retreating enemy. They had not been positioned for a threat departing from within, but they were fast. The first shot hit our port engine housing. The shuttle lurched sideways, and the interior lighting cut to emergency red. The second shot took the aft section. Dahl, bracing himself against the passenger bay wall, was thrown into the bulkhead. I heard something break in his body. The third shot breached the hull. Decompression gripped my legs and dragged my weight toward the rupture. Through the forward viewport, past Bewley's shoulder, I could see the Kearney in the distance, still fighting, still following Hargrove's time-stamped orders, still alive. The shuttle broke apart around me. The stars spun. The brown dwarf's rust-coloured light filled my vision, and then the cold took my lungs. And then there was nothing. I woke in the chair, left hand on my ribs, right hand below my collarbone, both legs braced hard against the deck as though fighting decompression that had ended 5 seconds ago. The coffee was 4 minutes old. The bridge was in pre-watch configuration. My uniform was clean and pressed and carrying no trace of 3 separate deaths. 3 places on my body remembered dying. The ribs from the boarding blade, the collarbone from the surrender execution, the lungs from the hull breach, phantom pain stacked in layers, each wound carried forward from a death the universe had erased and my nervous system had preserved. Something else came back with me too, a thinning. The reset had always had pressure to it, a hard seam at the edge of the moment. Wake, breathe, coffee, status report. The same instant catching me like a hook. Now the hook felt bent. This was the last iteration. I knew it the way I knew the phantom wounds, from a certainty that lived in my body rather than my reasoning. Whatever temporal effect the Covenant's pursuit ritual generated, whatever mechanism returned the recursor to witness and confirm, it was nearly spent. The archive had no root for what came next. The sacrament had reached the edge of its own scripture. This cycle would be the last. I would live through it or die through it, and either outcome would be permanent. "Admiral," Bewley began, "fleet status. All ships holding. Fuel at 41.3. I stood. "Pete, I need a fleet-wide command briefing in 20 minutes. Every ship captain on the secure channel." Hargrove came through the port-side hatch with his coffee. I let him deliver the fuel report this time. Every word, every number, every observation about the Ridgeway's thruster variants. I let him finish. I watched his face while he spoke. The square jaw, the twice-broken nose, the focused eyes of a man who had spent 30 years keeping ships and crews intact under conditions that would have killed less stubborn men. I had watched Dennis Hargrove die in every way a man could die aboard a warship. I had watched him hold a breached compartment until the atmosphere bled out. I had watched him carry wounded men through corridors filled with Covenant boarding teams. I had watched him issue commands from a chair soaked in his own blood, still coherent, still steady, as the bridge collapsed around him. Whatever Hargrove thought of me after what I was about to do, his competence would hold. His competence was what I was purchasing with everything I had left to spend. The briefing was the most calculated act of manipulation I had ever performed. I convened it on the secure channel. Hargrove, Bewley, and the captains of the 4 other military vessels that still had enough firepower to matter. Aldridge on the Jessup, Burris on the Lanham, Hewitt on the Dunmore, and Garza on the Polk. 6 men, each commanding a ship and crew, each carrying 11 months of accumulated exhaustion, and the unspoken assessment that their fleet admiral was either a tactical savant or a man in the final stage of a command-level breakdown. I presented the plan as a calculated gamble. The language I used was tailored to each man, shaped by thousands of iterations of observing how they processed risk, absorbed fear, and arrived at decisions. For Aldridge, I framed the charge as the logical endpoint of attrition math. They were losing ships in every engagement. Continued retreat guaranteed slow extinction. A single decisive action was the only operation that bent the survival curve. Aldridge was a numbers man. Even his grief came out as arithmetic. I had once watched him calculate civilian loss projections with a broken hand and a Covenant boarding team cutting through the door behind him. He responded to arithmetic. For Burris, I emphasized the tactical geometry. The Covenant's pursuit formation was structurally vulnerable against a head-on approach, and the reliquary at the rear carried minimal armament. Burris had been a tactical instructor before the war. He still spoke sometimes in the tone of a man correcting cadets at a training board, and when I laid the crescent formation across the display, his eyes sharpened before I finished drawing the vector. "That gap between 4th and 5th cruisers," Burris said. "It collapses if they rotate the outer wing inward." "They won't," I said. "You can't know that. I know their doctrine. Their formation protects against prey running away. It does not know what to do with prey that turns." Burris stared at the display for one more second. Then he nodded once. For Bewley, I described the piloting challenge of threading the fleet through the Covenant crescent at combat speed. His posture changed. He was already solving the problem before I finished presenting it. For Hewitt and Gaza, I selected different arguments: professional duty, operational precedent, the specific obligations of their commands. Each argument was true. Each was chosen because I had spent 6,000 iterations learning which truths moved which men. The captains agreed. The math held. The geometry was visible. The alternative, continued flight with diminishing fuel, was extinction on a longer timeline. Hargrove did not agree. He waited until the channel closed and the other captains' feeds went dark. Then he crossed the bridge to where I stood at the tactical display. "You're ordering a direct assault against a superior force based on intelligence you cannot source, using a plan that depends on information you should not possess, targeting a vessel that nobody in this fleet has ever confirmed exists. Everything I told the captains is tactically accurate. The formation weakness is real. The target is real. The attrition math is real. The math is real. The source is missing." He dropped his voice below the hearing of the bridge crew. "I've been running command assessments on you in my head since this watch began, Admiral. The anticipation, the impossible knowledge, the way you speak to men as though you've already had the conversation and you're waiting for them to catch up." He paused. "Earlier you called Ensign Pruitt's son by name. Pruitt told me himself he has never spoken his son's name aboard this ship. He has never said it out loud on the Kearney. Dennis, how did you know his son's name?" "Two options. Tell Hargrove the truth, which would trigger the same competency review it had triggered 300 iterations ago, and the fleet would die without my coordination. Or use what I knew. I used what I knew." "Pruitt told you about that himself," I said. "In the conversation you had outside the forward armory after second watch, when you were checking on crew morale. The same conversation where you told him you haven't spoken to your own son since the colony transmissions went dark, and that you keep his last recorded message saved on your personal terminal because you can't bring yourself to play it past the first 2 seconds. You stop it every night, right after he says your name, because you're afraid that if you hear more than that, you won't be able to function the next morning. You've never told anyone this. You've never told anyone about the message or the 2 seconds, or why you stop it where you do." Hargrove went still. The expression on his face was one I had never seen across 6,000 iterations. Something beyond anger, beyond professional assessment, beyond the practiced calculation of a career officer weighing an impossible order. He was looking at me the way a man looks at something he cannot categorize, something wearing a familiar shape that has revealed itself to be something else entirely. I had not persuaded him. I had opened him. There was a difference, and no command necessity in the universe could make it clean. "The plan I've briefed will save what's left of the human species," I said. "I cannot explain how I know the things I know, and I cannot make it less disturbing than it is. If you refuse to execute this plan, everyone aboard these ships will be dead within the next few hours." Hargrove looked at the tactical display, then at the deck, then past me, toward the forward viewport. "The fleet will execute your plan, Admiral," he said. "I'll coordinate the formation with the other captains." He returned to his station. He did not look at me again. The Covenant arrived at bearing 270, on schedule, for the last time. The slipspace rupture split the rubble field in the familiar seam of white-blue light. The cathedral warship emerged compressed, then unfolded, blade-edged spires extending, weapons platforms locking into position, the full structure assembling itself against the brown dwarf's glow until it filled the viewport. The pursuit cruisers deployed behind it, 6 of them, spreading into their standard crescent. The liturgical broadcast filled every channel. That grinding, polytonal wall of sound I had heard 6,000 times and would hear now for the last. Behind the formation, under escort, the reliquary held its position at the rear. Dark hull, rounded architecture, the archive of every species the Covenant had guided to extinction, the carved bones of 100 civilizations, and the blank slabs, the uncarved bone, the empty prophecies, the doctrinal gap that no priest had filled because no priest could conceive of what belonged there. Boarding pods launching in 8 minutes, Bewley reported from Tactical. Standard deployment trajectory. I opened the fleet-wide channel. All ships, this is Admiral Lusk. Execute formation Osprey. All military vessels forward. Civilian convoy holds position in the rubble shadow. We are advancing directly into the Covenant formation. A beat of silence crossed the channel. Then the acknowledgements, Aldridge on the Jessup, Burris on the Lanham, Hewitt on the Dunmore, Garza on the Poke, the escort captains falling in. Hargrove confirmed the Kearney's readiness without inflection. All ships, I said, advance. The fleet turned. 23 warships and escorts, arranged in the assault formation I had prescribed, accelerated into the Covenant crescent. The civilian transports held behind us in the rubble field, shielded by the brown dwarf's magnetic interference and the fact that every Covenant weapon was about to be pointed in the wrong direction. The Covenant's response confirmed the blind spot in physical terms. Their crescent, optimized for pursuit, designed to envelop a retreating enemy from behind, could not reorganize fast enough to face a head-on charge. The wings were out of position, weapons arcs overlapping and interfering as pursuit cruisers scrambled to meet an attack coming from a direction their formation geometry had never been designed to address. The cathedral warship's boarding pods, already launched on their standard trajectory toward where the fleet should have been retreating, burned into empty space behind us. We hit the formation at full combat speed. The destroyer Lanham was the first ship we lost. A pursuit cruiser caught her broadside during the initial pass through the crescent, and her hull split along the port quarter. I watched decompression blow rubble and bodies into vacuum. Captain Burris, the tactical instructor who had seen the geometry of the plan and agreed because the math was beautiful, died on his bridge. I had watched Burris die in 417 previous iterations, in boarding actions and reactor failures and hull collapses. This time it was permanent. The frigate Polk went next, overwhelmed by 2 cruisers that managed to reorient faster than the others. The civilian transport Galena, which should have been safe in the rubble shadow, had drifted forward during the formation shift. A navigation error, a moment of panic from a young helmsman who turned the wrong direction and took a stray volley from the cathedral warship's main batteries. 600 people. I knew the helmsman's name. He was 22 years old, from Meridian Colony, and he shuffled cards left-handed in the mess hall because his right hand had never healed correctly after a pressure door accident in childhood. I had watched him teach Foley's ration printer child the rules of 5-card draw in an iteration neither of them remembered. He laughed too loudly when he won. He was dead now in every version of reality that would ever exist again. The fleet pushed through the crescent. The cathedral warship's batteries fired, and the cruiser Jessup lost her engine section, the blast tearing through the aft hull and sending the forward compartment spinning. Aldridge's last transmission was a damage report delivered in the clipped, numerical cadence he used for everything: casualties, fuel consumption, his own death. Hargrove managed the Kearney's damage control as the flagship took hits along her port side. Armor plating peeled from the hull in sheets. A secondary battery exploded, killing its gun crew. Hargrove issued repair orders, rerouted power, sealed compartments, and kept the ship fighting without once looking at me. Whatever he believed about the man sitting in the command chair, his hands did the work. His competence held. It was what I had paid for. The reliquary was behind the formation, where it always travelled. 2 Guardian vessels moved to intercept our approach, their weapons tracking us. I directed the Dunmore and 2 escort corvettes at the Guardians. The Dunmore took a direct hit to her bridge section. Captain Hewitt killed instantly, the man who had been 6 weeks from retirement when the war started and had never mentioned it because he considered the fact irrelevant. But her surviving crew kept firing. The corvettes flanked the second Guardian and crippled its weapons array. The corridor to the reliquary opened. "All batteries," I said. "Target the reliquary. Concentrated fire sustained." The Kearney and 3 surviving warships aligned their weapons. The reliquary's hull was thick, layered, reinforced against the slow erosion of centuries, built to preserve what it carried across spans of time that dwarfed human civilization. It had never been designed to withstand sustained military bombardment. The first volley cracked the outer plating. The second penetrated the interior structure. The third opened the ship from bow to stern. Through the hull breaches, visible on the Kearney's external cameras, I could see what was inside. Bone slabs tumbled from their brackets as the structural framework collapsed. Sealed chambers split open, spilling their contents into vacuum. Carved roots from 100 extinct species spun into the dark between stars. Biological specimens shattered in their resin cases. Sacred objects from civilizations whose names the Covenant had recorded and whose populations the Covenant had erased, scattered into the rubble field. The human chamber broke apart last. My 6,000 iterations of suffering came loose in pale fragments. Every retreat, every failure, every death rendered in geometric scripture and then reduced to rubble. The Covenant's response was immediate. The cathedral warships broadcast. That grinding wall of liturgical sound that had filled every channel since the battle began, cut off mid-phrase. The silence that replaced it was structural, as though something had been removed from the foundations of the Covenant's operating system, and every process that depended on it had frozen. The pursuit cruisers broke formation. Their movements lost coherence. Individual ships drifting, weapons cycling down, maneuvering thrusters firing in contradictory patterns as though each vessel had been severed from whatever central authority governed its actions. The cathedral warship itself went dark. Its spires, which had been tracking the battle with subtle adjustments in orientation, stopped moving. On the communication channels, a new sound emerged where the liturgical broadcast had been, something the Kearney's translation systems could not render into any known category, a transmission that wavered between frequencies in a pattern that suggested neither language nor coordination. A system built on theological certainty had encountered an event its theology could not contain. The Covenant's pursuit was broken. The Extinction sacrament could not continue with its prophetic archive destroyed. The bones were gone. The carved roots were gone. The accumulated record of every completed extinction, every proof that the Covenant's holy work was sanctioned and inevitable, was rubble, spinning in the vacuum alongside the wreckage of the most sacred vessel their civilization had ever built. To continue the hunt would be to perform a sacrament without scripture. To fire again would be to act without authorization. Their command structure was a priesthood, and the priesthood had lost the text that told it what the universe permitted. They would have to return to their theological authorities. They would have to petition for new prophecies, argue whether an extinction could be reauthorized after its archive had been annihilated. If that process was possible at all, it would consume years. "Helm," I said, "set slipspace coordinates for the Pelham corridor. All surviving ships prepare for emergency jump." The fleet, 31 ships of the original 47, aligned for transit. The Covenant did not pursue. Their vessels drifted in the wreckage of their own formation, silent, The cathedral warship's blade-edge spires dark against the brown dwarf's glow. The broadcast that had accompanied every extinction for millennia, replaced by a silence that would last, I suspected, for a very long time. We jumped. Slipspace was quiet. The transit field wrapped the Kearney in blue-white distortion, and the bridge settled into the stillness that followed a jump, the drives vibrating at a frequency I could feel through the deck plating, the displays cycling navigation data, the crew inhabiting the specific kind of silence that comes after sustained violence. 16 ships gone, 43,000 dead by Bewley's preliminary count. The Lanham, the Polk, the Jessup, the Dunmore, the Galena, and 11 other vessels, military and civilian, destroyed or abandoned during the charge. Their crews were gone. The 22-year-old helmsman from Meridian Colony who shuffled cards left-handed. Burris and his beautiful geometry. Aldridge and his final damage report. Hewitt, 6 weeks from a retirement the war had made irrelevant. Foley, who had checked his sidearm 3 times before dying in a corridor that no longer existed. Dahl, who had died against a shuttle bulkhead in that same erased iteration. Pruitt's son, whose name I knew, and whose father would survive to hear it again, only because I had used that knowledge as a weapon against the one man on this bridge who had still treated me as something recognizable. The crew was beginning to absorb what had happened. Some ran damage assessments. Others communicated with surviving ships in the convoy. A few sat at their stations with the stillness of men who understood they had lived through something they could not yet name. I sat in my command chair. The loop was over. I knew it the way I knew the phantom wounds, as a certainty that lived in my body, defined by the absence of something that had been present so long its removal felt like amputation. There would be no more resets. If I closed my eyes now, I would not wake in this chair to the coffee at 4 minutes old. Every death from this point forward, mine, theirs, anyone's, would be permanent. The feeling I expected was relief. What arrived was closer to the disorientation of sudden deafness. For 6,000 iterations, I had known what came next. Every conversation, every alarm, every report, every word from every crew member, a repetition of something I had already heard. That foreknowledge was gone. The bridge sounds around me, console tones, quiet talk between stations, the vibration of the drives, were playing for the first time. I was hearing my own ship the way a stranger hears it. Hargrove approached. He stood at my right side where he always stood, and looked out at the slipspace transit through the forward viewport. The blue-white distortion moved across the glass in patterns I could not predict. "Damage reports from the convoy," he said. "The Meridian Sun has hull damage along her lower decks, but she'll hold. The Caldwell lost her secondary power grid. Engineering has a bypass running. Civilian ships are stable." He paused. "The crew is asking what happened, why the Covenant stopped. I don't have an explanation they'd accept." "No," Hargrove said. "I don't imagine you do." He was quiet for a while. The slipspace distortion shifted across the viewport in bands of light that folded over each other in arrangements I had never seen, because the fleet had never been here before. In this corridor, at this speed, traveling in this direction, alive. "The transit light does something strange at this speed," Hargrove said. He was watching the viewport. "My father was a merchant marine, sailed container ships across the Pacific. He used to talk about how the sunrise looked different from mid-ocean, how the water changed the color of everything, bent it somehow. I used to think he was inventing it." He shifted his weight against the console. He wasn't. I had never heard Dennis Hargrove say those words. In 6,000 iterations, 6,000 versions of every conversation, every report, every briefing, every exchange between a fleet admiral and his flag captain, Hargrove had never mentioned his father's work on container ships, had never compared slipspace transit light to a Pacific sunrise, had never offered a memory that was not framed by military context. The sentence belonged to a future I had never visited, generated by circumstances that had never existed until now. I did not know what to say. After 6,000 iterations of knowing every word before it was spoken, I had no practice at hearing something for the first time. My hands rested on the armrests of my command chair, and the phantom wounds beneath them were fading. The ribs, the collarbone, the lungs, each one releasing its hold by slow degrees, pain from deaths that were growing distant in a way they had never been able to grow distant before, because before, the next death had always been coming. The fleet moved forward through slipspace, 31 ships carrying 157,000 people into a corridor no prophecy had mapped, commanded by a man who could no longer see what was coming and did not yet know whether that blindness was a wound or the first thing in 6,000 lives that had been given back to him.